Good afternoon. We are learning living with light, and today's topic is going to be the mitzvah of challah, of separating challah. So just to be clear, we use the word challah colloquially to refer to the braided bread that we eat on Shabbos, but that is not what challah is in our tradition of halacha. Challah, as we'll describe, is the mitzvah or the act of that which we separate from when we have dough, we have to separate some out, and it was ideally given to the Kohen, although nowadays we don't do that anymore. So as we go, we'll talk a little bit more about what it is as well as why it is. Um, so, so the mitzvah of challah first appears in Sefer Bamidbar, in the book of Bamidbar, following the story of the Meraglim, of the spies. And there's one other thing in between, but it's shortly after. So let us take a look there. Bamidbar, chapter 15. It says, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. It's verse 17, Pasuk Yud Zayin. And Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Daber al b'nei Yisrael. Speak to b'nei Yisrael, v'amarta lehem, and say to them, B'voachem el haaretz, asher ani mevi eschem shama. When they come to the land that I am bringing them, v'haya ba'achalchem yilechem haaretz. It will be when you eat from the bread of the land, Tarimu truma laHashem. You should separate out truma. You shall, here they translate, you shall set aside a gift for Hashem. Um, and the word truma really comes from like raising something up. You should raise something up for Hashem. And then it says, Reishis arisosechem. The first of your dough, challah. Okay, the word challah. Tarimu truma ki trumas goren kain tarimu osa. So could read it. There's a question how to read this, but the first of your dough or of your kneading bowl, challah tarimu truma, you should raise it up as challah ki trumas goren, just like the truma of the threshing floor, kain or the granary, kain tarimu osa. So should you separate this. So the verse is connecting this type of truma, this type of gift, to a different kind of truma, what we generally refer to as truma, which is trumas goren, separating from our granary, our threshing floor, that produce that we grow. Once we gather it together, we are now required to give to the Kohen truma. Torah doesn't stipulate a specific amount. It's not meiser. That's a different thing. The tithe that goes to the Levi, that it's a specific amount. That's 10%. Meiser Rishon, the first kind of meiser. There's different types of meiser, but there's something also truma. Truma is for the Kohen, and the Torah doesn't tell us a specific amount how much you have to give, but you have to give um, from your harvest, at least when it comes to wheat and or the grains, the main grains, and olives and the like. Um, so the Torah is telling us that this is like that. This is a similar kind of thing. It's also a truma. It's going to go to the Kohen. And although we have right in there that word challah, which is going to become the term that is used to describe this mitzvah, and it's used meaning by the Mishnah really. The Mishnah has Mesachas Challah, the tractate of Challah, and that's the term that we use to describe this mitzvah. Maybe it's a way to distinguish it from other type, the regular form of truma, but that's the main word, and we'll discuss shortly what that means, why we use the word challah to describe this. And then finally it says, Meireshisa risosechem titzu Hashem truma l'darosechem. So here he actually tells us what to do. In the previous verse, it just told us to separate it. And now it says to give it to Hashem, to give it to God, which doesn't say to give it to the Kohanim, but that's how it's understood, maybe because of the comparison to Truma. It's given to Kohen. Okay, in the classic traditional way, in the Torah's way. So those are the verses. Now there's one other important verse that the commentaries connect, which is in the book of Yechezkel, where the Navi there, the prophet's going through different gifts that we give to the Kohanim, to the priests, and it says there, chapter 44, verse 30, Bereshis kol bikri kol v'chol trumas kol mikol trumosechem lakohanim yeh. So first of all, your first fruits, the bikurim, and the first of your calls heave offerings. I mean, it's a translation of truma, I guess. The first that you should give from your crops, and vereshis arisosechem, and the first of your kneading bowls of your dough. Titnu lakohen, you should give to the kohen. Lihaniach bracha el beisecha, says the verse, to bring blessing into your home. So we have here an explicit verse in Yechezkel telling us it could be it's modifying everything previously in the verse, but certainly the last thing brings blessing into your home. And the truth is that it makes sense to say that it is specifically speaking about the last thing. Now, it could be also going back on the previous ones, but there is a specific relationship between Challah and your home, which is, as opposed to regular truma. Regular truma, you harvest, you bring all the stuff to the granary, to the threshing floor, and you pile it up. And it's at that point that it becomes obligated in truma. You don't have to necessarily do it at that moment, but it is now, you cannot eat it now. It is what we call tevel. It is forbidden to eat until you separate out truma. And and that happens outside of your home. That happens in the field, in the granary, once you pile up the wheat. Challah, though, when does the obligation of challah kick in? It's once you put the ingredients together in a bowl and you make dough, really, or once they mingle, even before you really need it. But once the water and the flour begin to mix, so at that point already, that's when you're not already, but only then are you obligated in challah. At that point, the dough becomes forbidden to consume until you separate out the challah portion, and that happens in the home. That happens in the home. So usually, I mean, seemingly, that's where where you're baking, not out in the field, and so there's a direct connection between the mitzvah of challah and home that it should bring blessing into the home. But it's more than that. Rav Hirsch says that we when we come to the field with our grain, we pile it up. So that's a moment of like, wow, look at the blessing that Hashem has given us. I see all my grain in front of me, and I've had such a bountiful crop, and I have to recognize the gift that Hashem has given me. And one of the ways of expressing that recognition is taking a part of it and offering it to Hashem. And the way we do that is we give it to the Kohanim, to his representatives, but it's with that recognition of the blessing of the crop that we then separate out the regular truma. And we're not allowed to eat that grain until we have done that, until we've separated out that truma. The same thing, that recognition is renewed again when we begin to bake with our flour and we begin to prepare our bread for us and our family, and we recognize and we contemplate the incredible gift and the incredible personal attention that Hashem has given us to provide for us in our household, for us and our household. And so at that moment when we begin to knead our dough, there's like a second round of recognition of the gift of Hashem. And it's with that inspiration and that moment of recognition that we once again are taught, are instructed, we should separate out another portion for the culling, right? In a certain way, it's interesting. We already separated a portion of this grain when it was in its grain state, when it was they already had a gift given to the Kohen, and now we have to do it again once we start to make it into dough. Rav Hirsch says because there's like a new level of recognition of the gift of Hashem when we and maybe a little bit more personal and direct when it's in our house and we dedicate a portion to Hashem. So sorry, it's in our house and we see the gift that Hashem has given us personally, and then we once again dedicate some of that for Hashem, and so that would explain why it brings bracha into the house because it's done in the house. Yes, Robert.
I mean, another issue is that the regular truma only applies in Eretz Israel, but we take challah everywhere.
So that is true, although we only take it everywhere midrabanan.
Right.
Now, why we don't take truma midrabanan everywhere, you can is a question you can ask, but yeah, it's only rabbinic outside of Israel. But we'll hopefully touch on some of that. Um, Now, one of the questions that the commentaries try to deal with is what is the connection between Challah and the spies, the Meraglim? Because as I mentioned, this is Parsha Shlach. The major event of Parsha Shlach is, and every rabbi's drasha is going to be about the Meraglim most likely. That takes the main focus, although there's other important things in Shlach as well. Besides for Challah, there's also tzitzis and at the end. But the Meraglim, the story of the spies, definitely takes the most of our attention. And then right afterwards, first we have libations mentioned, and then we have Challah mentioned. And the question is there a connection, or what is the connection between Challah and the Meraglim? So so I think the very simple answer would be that the Meraglim came to the land of Israel and they looked at it and they didn't see the hand of God there. They didn't see Hashem's blessing there, and they came back and gave a bad report. And so right after that, we're instructed when you come to the land of Israel and you need and when you and you make your dough, you're you're going to demonstrate that you see the hand of Hashem, you see the hand of Hashem operating in the land by separating out that truma, that piece. I think that's like the most simple. Then you just have to explain, well, I mean, you could say that for regular truma also that's done on your grain, not just for challah. So it needs a little bit of tightening to that explanation. The Sforno makes a comment which I really don't fully grasp what he means. The Sforno says, after the sting of the spies, it was necessary to have the mitzvah of challah in order that they should be deserving to have blessing in their households. And he quotes the verse in Yechezkel that we just mentioned, that challah brings blessing into the household. And he quotes another story of Eliyahu Hanavi, when Eliyahu Hanavi, during the time of famine, he goes to stay with this woman and her son, and he Isha Tzarfatis, and she like there's a whole back and forth about her providing for Eliyahu, and the Sforno understands that exchange that she's giving him challah. Eliyahu Hanavi was possibly a Kohen. That's a big discussion, and the Sforno understands that she was giving him challah. So in any event, though, that's just an example, and there it brought great blessing. There was then miracles occurred, and there was a lot of blessing that came upon her house miraculously. But so the Sforno is saying that after the sting of the spies, it's now necessary in order to have blessing upon their households that we have the mitzvah of challah. I don't know the connection. I'm not sure like what. Yes, after the sting of the spies, we maybe are not as deserving a blessing. I don't know specifically like why challah, why the household, like so that's something to further contemplate. Okay, the Sefer HaChinuch is the classic work that tries to explain the reasons behind the mitzvos, and and the Sefer HaChinuch gives two what he calls roots of the mitzvah, two reasons to understand what is the purpose of the mitzvah of challah. We've mentioned it's just the idea of recognizing Hashem's hand. He actually gives two other reasons. He says, first of all, um, kind of like flips the script. He says everybody eats bread. That's what people live on. And therefore, Hashem wanted to give us a mitzvah that we could always do, that we could do regularly. He wanted to give us merit, to grant us opportunity to do his will. And to bring blessing into our household. So, so the purpose of the mitzvah of challah is because Hashem wanted to give us the opportunity to do a mitzvah and bring blessing into our household. And since everybody eats bread, everybody bakes bread, it's a staple of life. So he gave us a specific mitzvah regarding bread. Maybe to say it a little bit differently is that maybe he's saying that Torah recognizes that not everybody is going to be a field owner. So not everybody is going to separate out regular truma, um, but everybody is going to bake bread in their house. Again, obviously that's not always the case, but especially nowadays. But that's perhaps how he's looking at this is an opportunity to bring blessing upon our houses. Hashem wanted to spread the wealth, so to speak, to give everybody that opportunity to separate out for him, for the Kohanim, and the purpose of the mitzvah is to bring us merit. And also he says um, that that then our food now becomes both a provision for our body and for our soul. Right? Don't look at your food as just something that's supporting your body, but now it's something we do a mitzvah with, and it's something that supports our soul as well, therefore. That's number one. Number two, he says that the purpose of this mitzvah is to support the Kohanim. The Kohanim don't own land, they don't own fields. They need our support. That's why we have the mitzvah of Truma in the first place, of giving them a portion of our produce. But you give them a portion of your produce, it's still in the grain stage. It's not ready to eat. And so there's toil and work necessary to turn that into food. Now we give them that, okay, but this is even better. Here we are to give them our dough, ready to eat, ready to be baked, and there's no work necessary on their part, except for maybe if we give it in the dough state to bake it, but it's all ready to roll, and no pun intended, and they can easily turn that into sustenance. So the Svarno's second reason is the purpose of this mitzvah is to support the Kohanim, to support those who serve in the Beis Hamikdash in the temple. Okay, now just briefly, we're not discussing the halachos in depth, but just to get a little bit of a sense of what it's about. So as I mentioned, the obligation to separate challah kicks in once you mix the flour and the water. At that point, even though it's not yet dough, it hasn't been kneaded together, but it's already beginning to mix. It's at that point that you are no longer allowed to consume this dough without separating out flour. Now, the Gemara derives from the way it's described in the verse what the amount of dough what amount of dough you need to have to be obligated to separate out challah. In other words, if you only make a tiny bit of dough, the obligation doesn't kick in. It only kicks in if it's if it is what's the language? One second. Sorry. Thought I included it. Oh yeah. So right. So it says Reshis arisosechem, the first of your kneading bowl, and the Gemara derives that their typical dough was an omer. an omer. Now, how much is an omer? So then you have to break down what an omer is. It comes out to the equivalent of, sorry, it's the tenth of an omer, though. It says, no, sorry. An omer is a tenth of an ephah. Okay, he breaks down the calculation. It comes out to 43 and a fifth eggs. 43 and a fifth eggs worth that size. That amount of flour is obligating challah. Now, how much is that? Okay, so now you have different opinions on how you measure that out. So you can check, contemporary halachic works, but usually we say that it's a question. So if you're using 5 pounds of flour, we say then you would make the blessing. If you're using less, a certain amount, I don't remember if it's 2.5 or whatever it is, 3, go look it up. Then you still separate challah, but without a blessing, and the less than that amount, you wouldn't even need to separate challah. That in between zone is like a suffix. We're unsure. We don't know if that's enough, so we won't make the blessing, but we'll still separate out the challah just in case. Um, Now, how much do you have to separate? How much challah do you need to separate? So the Torah doesn't tell us how much. There's no specific amount. Even the smallest amount would suffice to fulfill the mitzvah of separating out challah. However, the rabbis, the chachamim, they gave us an amount. They said that it's 1/24th of the bread, and they learned it out, they derived it, but it seems at least that it's not a Torah requirement to separate out that amount or to give that amount to the Kohen. It's just rabbinic, and and although if we have time, we'll come back to that point. But for now, we'll say that it's completely rabbinic in nature to separate and to give that amount to the Kohen. And that would be true. I believe that amount is still required in Israel, and so challah in the land of Israel was a Torah obligation. Nowadays, most poskim say that it's no longer a Torah obligation. It's the way that things are set up right now. It's no longer a Torah obligation, but as I understand it, it's still required to separate out 1/24th in Israel. Outside of Israel, where it's only rabbinic, we only do it so that kind of we don't forget about the mitzvah of challah. So it's much more lenient, and a kezias, olive's worth is enough. I saw some say advice to take about a golf ball size. That's what we usually aim for here. But there's no requirement it's not based on how much dough you have here outside of the land of Israel. It's just a kezias. It's rabbinic in nature, and it's much more lenient. There's a question of what to do with the dough once you've separated it, and why we can't give it to a Kohen. So we're not going to get into that too deeply. There's different customs either to burn it or to just dispose of it. Some people hold of different things. Okay, now why is challah called challah? What does the word challah even mean? So the truth is that we do find the word challah in other contexts in the Torah, and it seems to mean like a roll or a loaf or something like that. But the Haksav Kabbalah, Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, who was a linguist, he points out that over here it doesn't really make sense to say that that's what it means, because right now it's still dough. It's not really a loaf. It's when the Torah says in verse 20, verse Chaf, Reishis arisosechem challah tarimu truma. The first of your kneading bowl, challah, you should separate. It's not a loaf, it's not a roll, it's still dough. So to say that it means like a loaf, he doesn't think that would be accurate over here. Then he quotes a suggestion that when we refer to challah here, we don't mean the part that you separate. We mean the dough that remains is really the challah. Why? So, um, Okay, I'm not actually sure what is prompting this commentary that he's quoting to say it that way. So let's just move on to what the Kaksava Kabbalah himself says. So so he himself suggests that the reason that the reason why we call this challah is because of what it does. And what it does is it is michalel. It what's a good word? It um deconsecrates. So right now the this dough is now consecrated. The whole thing is holy. The whole thing is forbidden to consume. When I separate out a portion of it, that acts to be michalel, to desecrate, but not desecrate in a bad way, to deconsecrate the rest of the dough and make it now no longer holy, that it's now permitted to be consumed. And and because it it accomplishes that, because what I separate accomplishes the deconsecration, it's called challah, because it is michalel, it deconsecrates. And he points out that we have other examples where we call things based on what they do. So, for example, he says the knife that's used to shech, to slaughter an animal, is sometimes called a ma'achelas. What is a ma'acheles? From the word achila, to eat. So the knife is called that which causes you to eat, because until you shech the animal, you can't eat it. So the knife is a ma'acheles. It's what enables you to eat. So he says that similarly here, the dough that we separate is called challah because it is mechalel. It deconsecrates the rest of the dough and allows you to eat it. And then he gets into a very fascinating discussion where he wants to read into the verses potentially that there might be a distinction between how much you are required to separate and how much you're required to give to the Kohen. Meaning, I mentioned before that on a Torah level, there's no specific amount that you are required to give or separate or give. The rabbi said 1/24th. For us, it's just a kazayis, an olive's worth. But on a Torah level, the Sefer HaChinuch says the usual understanding is there's no required amount. Um, there is, however, a responsum of the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, who, trying to answer up a contradiction in Rashi and other things, suggests something very novel, which is that there's no requirement, there's basically that there's two steps to challah. There's one step which is separating the challah from the dough. And at that point, once you separate it, the dough is now permitted to eat. And it doesn't matter what you do with what you separated, you're allowed to eat the dough. There's a second step, which is that you're supposed to take that dough and give it to the Kohen. But even if you never ended up giving it to the Kohen, once you separated it, you're permitted to eat your original dough. Um, you are required to give it to the Kohen. It belongs to the Kohen. It would be stealing not to give it to the Kohen. Again, nowadays we don't, but because they can't have it. But the in the original formulation of it, you're supposed to give it to the Kohen. But even if you don't, you're allowed to consume the dough. And Haksava Kabbalah kind of builds out this idea of the Noda B'Yehuda. So the Noda B'Yehuda says that actually there's no specific amount required for the first step. In order to permit the dough to be eaten, the Torah doesn't specify any amount. It just says, like Trumas Goren, that the first of your dough you should separate. But just like you separate regular truma from your granary, and it doesn't tell us an amount, it could be any amount. But then it says in the next verse, verse 21, from the first of your kneading bowl, titnu la Hashem truma. You should give it to Hashem. You should give it to the Kohen. And he says to give something, if you give too little, it's not considered giving. If you take a smidgen, give it to them, that's not giving them. So to give them, there's a minimal amount. And when the sages say 1/24th, that's the minimal amount. You have to give that. And the Noda B'Yehuda understands that that's the Torah requirement to give that much. And uh, and so Aksaba Kabbalah over here, when he's discussing this language, this the meaning of the word challah and saying it means to deconsecrate, he says that that's why in verse 20 it uses the word challah, because in verse 20 it's just the act of being mechalel, of deconsecrating, of separating out a little bit, and thereby making the dough, the rest of the dough, permitted to eat. Before now, you couldn't eat it. By separating out, you now have deconsecrated the dough, and now the rest is permitted to eat. Um, and and so that act has no specific amount. That act has no specific amount. All you're doing is deconsecrating the dough by separating out some. So there it calls it challah because you are now rendering the dough permitted to eat. And then the next verse mentions that the you should give the dough to the Kohen. So there, all of a sudden, it has to be an act of giving. Then there's, in order for it to be considered giving something, it has to be of significance, and it would have to be at least 1/24th of the dough, even on a Torah level. It's possible to read that into the verses. Others disagree. It seems that's not necessarily the accepted halacha, that there's a Torah obligation to give 1/24th, but it could be read into the verses. There's also a question about what the bracha should be when you separate out challah. Some say it should be lahafrish truma, to separate out truma, and some say it should be lahafrish challah, to separate out challah, and some say lahafrish challah min ha'isa, to separate challah from the dough. Um, um, he says that therefore, according to what we're saying, it really makes sense to say challah, to separate challah, not to separate truma, because there's two steps here. There's one which is separating out the dough. That's challah. That is the act of deconsecrating the dough. There's a separate step which is giving it to the Kohen. That's we could call truma. When you elevate it and you give it to the Kohen, truma means to elevate. So if you were making a bracha on the act of giving it to a Kohen, it would make sense to refer to it as truma. But we're not making the bracha on the act of giving it to a Kohen. We're making a bracha on the act of separating it, and there, when at the act of separating, that's challah. That is an act of deconsecrating the dough, and therefore the word challah makes more sense. So he explores the verses based on this understanding of challah to mean to deconsecrate. Then he says there's one other understanding, one other way you could explain the word challah. The word challah could be related to the word techilah, the beginning, or vayachel sometimes means like he began, and and this is the beginning. As soon as this dough begins to exist, the obligation to separate challah, kicks in. So at the very beginning of its existence, there is this obligation, and therefore we call it challah because it's at the origins of this dough. This is what we are obligated to separate out. And he explores the difference then between the word challah as meaning beginning and the word rashis, which is used in the verse as meaning beginning, and he differentiates. But in any event, so he seems to have two primary approaches to what the word challah is. One is it comes from the word lechalel, which is to deconsecrate the dough, and the other is that it relates to the word techilah or vayachel, which means the beginning of this dough, which is when the obligation to separate it begins. Okay, now we associate the mitzvah of challah with to be a woman's mitzvah. Now, it's not specifically a woman's mitzvah. It's everybody is obligated in the mitzvah of challah, but there is something unique about it that it applies especially for women. Meaning, if we have the choice of who should do it, then we ideally ask or allow a woman to do it over a man. And the question is why? So there is a Mishnah in Shabbos, which we read as part of the Friday night davening when we read through the different Mishnayos, the Mishnahs from the second chapter of Tractate Shabbos. And there it says that for three averos, for three sins, women could potentially die in childbirth. And one of them is they're not careful about the laws of nida, of family purity. One is challah, and one is hadlakas haner. One is lighting Shabbos candles, which I think we discussed briefly when we talked about Shabbos candles. This idea, why it's specific to women. And the Gemara asks why, and the Gemara says, first it asks about nida, family purity, menstruation laws. What's the reason that a woman would be punished to die in childbirth for not being careful? The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, he kilkala b'chadrei vitna, lefikach tilke b'chadrei vitna. So it's like measure for measure. If she wasn't careful about the chambers of her womb, about the laws of nida, so she's going to be afflicted in the womb in the act of childbirth. The Gemara then says, okay, that only explains that one, but what about challah and lighting candles? What are you going to say about that? So then the Gemara kind of takes a new approach, and it says, rather, it's like the teaching of a certain Galilean, that Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said, Revi istam nasati bochem, al iske dam hizarti eschem. So I placed blood in you when you were formed, and I warned you about matters of blood. So it seems to be that in the formation of a person, okay, let's actually, I'm not entirely sure what the full reference there is. Let's just go to the challah part. Then it says, Reishis karasi eschem al iske reishis zarti eschem. So it says that I called you first. I called you first, and um, and so I warn you about matters relating to first. So actually, at this point, the Gemara doesn't have anything to do with childbirth. The Gemara basically seems to say that it doesn't have anything to do with childbirth specifically. The Gemara is just trying to bring out that these are really important mitzvahs because we as a people are called Rashis. We're called the first of Hashem's nations, and the mitzvah of challah is called Rashis. It's called the first of our kneading bowl. And so there's this intrinsic connection between us as a people and the mitzvah of challah, and therefore it's very significant. That's really all that we have so far from this Gemara. The Gemara then goes on, I didn't include it here, and the Gemara asks, well, why did they get punished in childbirth? Why? And the Gemara says, well, it has different versions of how it wants to say, but basically it seems the Gemara is saying, well, it's not specifically childbirth, it's just that that's when a woman is already in a precarious situation, dangerous already, and so if something is going to happen to her, that could be the time. If she's deserving of something, then that could be the time because it's a more precarious situation already. Which means the Gemara seems to come to the point that there's nothing specific about childbirth that would be the timing of why they would be punished. It's just like that's already a dangerous time. Fine. Yeah, Robert.
And the Gemara goes on also to talk about situations that men are particularly likely to be punishing because they're situations that are dangerous for men. So it's extending the principle,
Right.
the general principle.
Very good. Yeah. So basically, right. So the principle there that it brings out is that like when a person is already in a precarious situation, their deeds are more maybe carefully checked by Hashem, and so we're not to put ourselves into dangerous situations if we have the choice. Um, so okay. So, but what does that have to do with women? Meaning, so far, this doesn't have any. We didn't say anything that has anything to do with a woman. Just says that it's the first we are the first of Hashem's people, and we're called that, and Challah is called Reishis, so it's very important. So what does it have to do with women? So Rashi on the Gemara brings down two possibilities. One is based on a midrash, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the other is that Rashi just says the ode shitzarchei abayis tluyin ba. The needs of the house are dependent on her, meaning the woman is the balabasta, she's the one in charge of the household and the baking and she runs the kitchen, and so challah is associated with the woman of the house. Um, so in other words, since this is her house, so she's the one who's connected to the mitzvah of challah. That doesn't give us so much into insight into why we associate the mitzvah with her. Maybe we could build it out a little bit and say we already mentioned that challah, the verse says in Yechezkel, brings blessing to the household. Um, and blessing, by the way, could mean different ways to understand it, but like enhancement, increasing of what we already have. So actually, the Netziv says that the mitzvah of challah is when it's dough, because dough can rise more. You can have blessing in the dough. Once it's bread already, now if you didn't separate challah when it was dough, you could still separate it when it's bread, or you still need to separate it once it's bread, but it should be done when it's dough. And then the Tiv says that that's the time where it could be blessed, so it could rise. Who knows when you put that challah in the oven how big it's going to come out, right? So there's much room for blessing when it's still in the dough stage. When it's once it's already bread, it's already confined to its size. The only blessing maybe could be how much it fills you up. So being that the woman is in charge of the running of the house, so she's the one from whom blessing will come or should come. That's one possibility. The other possibility that Rashi references is a medrash, and and the medrash says as follows. It's really, we put together two midrashim. Let's look at the last one first. It's Bereshis Rabbah 18:8. It says, why was a woman given the mitzvah of challah, specifically a woman? Says the Gemara, says the Medrash, al yidei shekilkala es Adam Arishon, because she, meaning Chava, Eve, brought ruin upon Adam. Shahaya Gemar Chalaso Shalom. He was like the challah of the world. Lefikach nitan la mitzvah challah. Therefore, she was given the mitzvah of challah. Adam was the challah of the world. What in the world does that mean? Let's go back one medrash. Earlier in the Midrash Rabbah, it says, we're going to just start in the middle. It says, the ish trumos yahar sena. It quotes a verse in Mishlei that says, a man of trumot destroys it. Ze Adam harishon. This is referring to Adam. Shahaya gemar chalaso shalolam. He was the challah of the world. The nikris challah truma, and we know that challah is also referred to as truma. Shenamar reish arisosem, as the verse calls, like we read, challah is sometimes called truma. So Adam is the challah of the world, and the verse, the ish trumos yarsana, a man of truma destroys it, means Adam, who is called challah, who is the challah of the world. He's the man of truma, because truma is challah. Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Kitzarta, keisha zoshi mekshakshekes isas mayim vagbas chalas mintayim. So a woman will knead her dough and with water, and she'll pull out challah. Kach betchila v'ed yara min haaretz v'achkach v'yitzar shem elkim. So Hashem brought mist upon the world. He put together the whole world, and then he brought forth Adam min ha'adama, from the land. Just like we separate out challah from the dough, so Adam is pulled out of, like, almost like the dough of the world, and that's why Adam is called the challah of the world, because Eve brought ruin upon Adam. She's the one who caused him to sin, so she has a rectification to do specifically within the mitzvah of challah. Now, yeah.
I was trying to raise my hand. I
Oh,
clicked the
okay.
wrong thing.
I thought you were applauding.
Yeah, well, sure, I'll do that too. It's funny because it really seems to me like the woman is more the challah because the woman was created for something taken out of Adam.
Right,
So I don't know if any of the commentaries talk about that, but
right,
and it's related to then the blessing that the women would bring because of the challah and the candles and the whatever family period.
right,
So
right. Yeah, so it doesn't seem that the Midrash is looking at it that way. The Midrash is more looking at the whole world is the dough, and man is the not. I don't. It's not specifically men versus women and in this point the creation since man was created first the of humankind really he was created if we understand Adam was both in the beginning and according to some she was then separated from him but humankind was drawn forth from the earth. That was an act of separating out challah. And I think within this though we can like get a maybe a deeper find a little bit of deeper meaning in this in what is being represented by the mitzvah of separating challah. The uh the Maharal um the Maharal points this out. He says there's different levels of existence. But you have the physical world. It's this conglomerate of all types of elements and materials. And Adam is like the holiest. Adam is the man is the holiest of all creations. And the way that Hashem made the world was made everything first, and then he separated out man. Now, other things were also separated from the earth, it's true, but the last thing to be separated out was man, the holiest of was mankind, the holiest of all creations, and so the act of separating out challah could be a reminder of that role that we have as people of just as we separate out the challah which and we make that holy, it could be a reminder that we of the intrinsic holiness that we each have, that we also were taken from the dough of the world and elevated for holiness, for the potential for holiness. Kind of a similar idea, the Shem Mishmuel um, writes that when that the mitzvah of challah came when we entered the land of Israel. Now, when we entered the land of Israel, something there was a fundamental change that occurred to the Jewish people, which was that they all became responsible for each other. The idea of arvus, the idea of that each is responsible for the other, began upon entry to the land of Israel. The acceptance was before, but the obligation happened when we entered the land of Israel. And so there was this fundamental change that occurred when we entered. It was almost like this bonding, this fusing of the Jewish people upon the entry to the land of Israel. And challah, he says there's different steps in the process of getting our produce and within that different mitzvahs. So for example, you have the mitzvah of bikurim, the first fruits. So as soon as you have one fruit that grows, that fruit is your first fruit, and you tie a string around it. It doesn't need other fruit to be the first fruit. It's just the first fruit is the first fruit, just one by itself. And then you have um, where you bring your grain and you make a pile, you join them together. That's when you now are obligated in truma. But at that point, they're not connected. They're not bonded. It's just a pile of grain, but each one separate. Challah is when you now take your materials and you make it into a dough. That's when it's bound together. And he says similarly, the Jewish people reach their full capacity to be fused, to be connected, when they are now all responsible for each other. When Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, when we're all responsible for each other, and that obligation, that expectation begins upon entering the land of Israel. And so upon entering the land of Israel, we become some. Oh, and he also says that when you join the dough together with the water, it's like it's a new entity. Maybe it now has the capacity to rise. It's completely different than what it was before. And and similarly, when we entered the land of Israel, we also took on a new existence. And the challah that we're instructed to separate when we enter the land of Israel reminds us of that, reminds us of just like the dough joins together, and it's considered a new existence, and therefore, because it's a new stage in the process, we need to separate a new gift to Hashem, even though we already separated when it was just a pile of grain, but now it's a new entity. It's been combined and has new potential within it. And so therefore we have to separate out a new gift to the Kohanim, because it's a new entity. So when we enter the land of Israel, we're to recognize that we are a new entity upon entering. We're all responsible for each other. And that's the timing of the mitzvah to be given when they entered the land of Israel to help them recognize that this new existence that they had, just like the dough has a new existence when you join it together, we're now also fused together. Now, what he doesn't explain, which I think comes back maybe to the Maharal, is so what's the separating? So we separate out dough. So yes, we have to separate out dough and give it to Hashem when the dough is now a new entity. But what about for us? So we enter the land of Israel. We are now fused together. We're now bound together. But why do we separate? And where does the mashal, where does the analogy carry over to us? Where are we separating ourselves? We said we became a big piece of dough. We're all fused together. We're all responsible for each other. But where do we separate ourselves? So perhaps it's at the same time a reminder that even though we're all fused together and responsible for each other, but each person on their own has the potential to elevate themselves and make themselves especially holy. And when we separate out that dough, we can remind ourselves of that potential within each person to rise above. There's certainly we are one big dough as a people, but each person can sanctify themselves to a different level. And so, taking these two ideas, the Maharal is saying that the act of separating challah is like man separating himself from the rest of creation, and the world is dough, and we are elevated, and that's what we remind ourselves. And the Shem Mishmol is similar, that not that the world is dough, but the Jewish people are dough. The Jewish people are this grand fusing of people that are bound and responsible for each other. At the same time, we can separate out challah. Any person can sanctify themselves even more. Okay, so just a quick summary. So we have the mitzvah of challah upon entering the land of Israel, a following on the heels of the Meraglim, the spies. There's blessing that we can potentially bring to our household if we recognize the gifts that Hashem gives us at this new stage as the challah, even though we already gave, but now we bring into our household and we have a newfound recognition of the gifts of Hashem. And so once again, we need to take that recognition, that appreciation, and dedicate some of it towards Hashem, and that will bring blessing into our house. The word challah either means to deconsecrate the rest of the dough, or it might mean just represent the idea of the beginning, because it's very very origin. As soon as the dough mixes with the water, that's when the obligation to separate challah kicks in, and why is it a special mitzvah for women? Either because they're in charge of the household, or because of what Chava brought about for Adam, who was the challah of the world, and there's a rectification there that they engage in. And finally, us being the challah of the world is And when we separate the dough, we remind ourselves that we are the challah of the world, meaning that we have the potential for holiness to elevate ourselves above all other creations. And even within the Jewish people, we are one big piece of dough. We're all responsible for each other. We're fused together. At the same time, each individual has the potential to elevate themselves like a piece of challah being separated. Okay. Yes.